Welcome back to lecture 1.3. We're going to be finishing up this chapter with the criminal justice process and some more about some of the ethics of the criminal justice system. So when we talk about the word system, it really indicates a process, a certain degree of order and discipline with this process. So in a classic study that was done by Herbert Packer, who was a professor at Stanford, he compared the ideal criminal justice process to an assembly line and just kind of moving down through it. One of the assignments and projects that we always do or try to do in the first couple weeks of, or usually first week of this class when it's not online, is to learn about this process and actually have you guys do a little puzzle type deal with that. But you can see on this slide that we're showing that we have this entry into the system. So we're just getting into the system through being arrested, usually is the process, or cited. Entry into the system can be as easy as getting pulled over for speeding. So there's then this process of prosecution and different pre-trial services. Adjudication is what happens. Are you found guilty and sentenced, or are you released on your own personal recognizance and then the case is dropped? So we're not going to get into that too much because you guys are going to be learning more about that. And then, of course, sentencing and sanctions, and then corrections. So there is a process that happens. All right. So we are talking about an idea of ethics and discretionary decision making, which is so huge in law enforcement. And this system, in the criminal justice system as a whole, it really relies on discretion, and this discretion helps to alleviate pressures. So when we talk about discretion, we're talking about the authority to choose between and among alternative courses of action based on individual judgment and conscience. So collectively, the discretionary decisions that are made by criminal justice professionals are said to produce an overall criminal justice process that does not operate within the confines of formal rules and laws. There is an informal decision-making process, and really that informal decision-making process relies on the discretion of individuals. And that helps to offset the rigidness that really can happen in these types of areas. So, goodness, getting ahead of myself here, guys. So we talk about interpreting the law. In many instances, criminal justice professionals must use discretion to interpret the laws, and laws can be vague or they can be super broad or even obsolete, certain laws that exist that we don't even know exist. So there is discretion that has to happen. But the problem that can happen, or the pitfalls of discretion, is that it does not always benefit from the discretionary decisions. So individual judgment that guides discretion can often be tainted by personal bias, irrational thinking, or just really ill will, which we know that. We hear about a lot about ill will in law enforcement's actions through media. So ethics are moral principles that govern a person's perception of right and wrong. Ethics has become a really important area of pre-employment screening in law enforcement. We need to hire ethical officers. We really do, because it's related to the concept of justice. So because criminal justice professionals, they're really representing the state, they're representing these laws, and they have the power to determine whether citizens are going to be treated ethically. So it's a huge responsibility. It's a profession. It's definitely not a job. There has been some shift in that in the recent years. And definitely something I drive and strive for with my criminal justice classes is to recreate this profession of working in the criminal justice system, from not just being a job, but really just being a decision to be ethical and to do the best for your community. So there are some blanks that do happen, though, that have to be filled in. And those discretionary decisions need to be filled in with, we sometimes call ethical blanks. So they're ethical decision making where we're filling in those blanks. So it's important. So in some cases, this ethical decision will be, excuse me, guys, the ethical decision will be intuitive, like you just know that this is the right thing to do. But training is a huge piece of that. Critical thinking is a huge piece of that. Being able to see all sides of a story. I always, would say young new officers would come in with guns a-blazing, and that's an expression, of course, but there's a lot more that goes into being a law enforcement officer or working in the court system or working in a jail system besides just the initial black and white. And I don't mean that in any sort of racial way. I just mean two sides of a story. There's a lot of gray area, and that's where that discretion and ethics comes into play. So really, what's happening in criminal justice today? I'd say that, terrorism is a big thing, after 9/11 and a lot of the strife that has happened in the Middle East, because this idea of domestic terrorism, and that is that terrorism that's happening really in our own borders. So when we talked about, when we're talking about domestic terrorism, there's some models that are, these two models right here that are looked at. So crime control model, and the underlying value of this model, that the most important function of the criminal justice process is to punish and repress criminal conduct. So the system must be quick and efficient. There has to be few restrictions, and this allows law enforcement to make discretionary decisions in apprehending criminals. Again, this is called the crime control model. Now, the due process model places primacy on the right of the individual to be protected from the power of the government. So it's not necessarily in direct conflict with crime control. The underlying values of the due process model focus more on protecting the rights of the accused through formal legal restraints on police, courts, and corrections. Due process, there should be due process. Due process model really relies on the courts to make more difficult to prove guilt. It rests on the belief that it is more desirable for society that 99 guilty suspects go free than a single innocent person be condemned. So when we talk about what is the bottom line in criminal justice system today, and we're talking about law enforcement, smarter policing, right? Just as law enforcement inevitably gets a great deal of blame when crime rates are high, American police forces have received much credit for the apparent decline in criminality. The consensus is that police have become smarter and more disciplined over the past several decades, relying on many other criminal justice institutions on evidence-based practices. And these are strategies that result in some positive outcomes. So different types of, CompStat, which is computerized statistical data driven that law enforcement agencies are using, looking at hotspots, directing resources towards hotspots where your crime rates are higher. This is evidence-based practices that we know that works. When we're talking about homeland security and terrorism, we are talking about, what is happening on our domestic territory, domestic grounds, not territories, but that's affecting us as a whole. So I'm going to let you guys read a little bit more about that, domestic terrorism, and some of the things that go into that. I don't want to get into depth into our lecture about that. So please take some time to go through those notes. So with that being said, I am going to stop the lecture right here. And the reason that I'm going to do this is because I want you guys to remember that that as we cover more and more into Okay, so as we talk about law enforcement today, I want you to read about the terrorism stuff in the chapter and take some notes on that. But it's important to talk about something that I think we need to really pay attention to even more so today, and that's about the de-incarceration movement. So some trends. After increasing by 500% from 1980 to 2008, the prison population in the United States is decreased in 5 of the 6 following years. More than 2 million offenders are in prison or jail in this country, and another 4.65 million are under community supervision. So there's really no question that economic considerations are starting to play a role in the shrinking inmate population. Federal, state, local governments are spending $80 billion a year on prisons and jails, and many corrections officials are under the pressure to decrease those costs. For every inmate, I'd say normal inmate that doesn't have any special medical needs, in the state of Washington, $36,000 a year. $36,000 a year for one inmate. So there's a lot of justice reinvestment that's happening, and this is really an umbrella term for policies that redirect funds by lowering state prison populations and putting that money into programs and improving community safety, really taking steps before offenders are arrested and go through the jail process. We're looking at recidivism rates. So recidivism is a big fancy word that basically just means reoffending. It's committing another crime after having already been punished for another one, for a previous one. Recidivism, hugely important word, recidivism, committing crimes again. So to further promote de-incarceration and to reduce recidivism, federal and state correction systems are making efforts to release qualified inmates from prison before their term ends. So there's, of course, processes for doing that, re-entry programs and systems. So hopefully we are seeing some changes. We also know that we have a decline in the use of death penalty. This is changing. It recently changed in our state where it was outlawed, the death penalty. And so we know that near the end of 2016, the death row population in American prisons stood at about 2,900 down from the 3,600 in 2000. So in 2016, 30 offenders were sentenced to death, which was down from 49 the year before. And 315 offenders put to death in 1996. All right, well, we're going to finish this chapter. Know that you guys have access to all the resources around the book on your Mind tab, and I hope that you have a great day.